In Georgia, in 1857, a table is set for people who believe the world bends for them. Lamplight shivers in crystal. Silver taps porcelain. Voices rise in practiced laughter, the kind that seals a room from consequence. At the edge of that glow, a woman moves with her eyes down and her hands steady, carrying plates as if carrying fate. She has cooked every meal in this house for a year. Tonight, the disaster is already in motion. Not as a shout, not as a knife, but as a careful absence. Something missing where something should be. A decision made long ago, performed now with the calm of routine. By morning, somebody will be dead. By the end of the season, there will be more. And when the sickness begins to move from one body to the next, the question won't be whether the house is cursed. It will be how a place built on control could be undone by the person who knows it best. A year earlier, she arrived inside a system that did not ask what she wanted. The paper trail, if there ever was one, reduces her to a role. Cook, woman, a set of hands assigned to heat and salt and serve. The name disappears. The labor remains. But she brought knowledge, not the kind praised at the table, but the kind that keeps a kitchen alive. How to stretch flour when it runs low, how to read a simmer by sound, how to make a thin pantry look generous. She knew what steadies a body and what weakens it, and she knew how small changes can hide inside routine. She also carried an early constraint, like a private law. Maybe it was promised to someone she loved. Maybe it was the last clean line she could draw around herself. The words aren't recorded, but the meaning is, I will not become the one who harms. At first, the vow held because it had to. Her days were measured by footsteps, bells, and orders called without eye contact. She learned the house by repetition, the corridor that always echoed, the doorway that always stuck, the shelf where the heavy things sat above the light things. Invisibility was enforced and rewarded. When she did her job well, she was ignored. When she did it poorly, she was remembered. And proximity became leverage in a way the people upstairs never noticed. She stood close enough to hear what they called jokes, close enough to see who feared whom, close enough to watch the rituals that made power feel natural. In any controlled place, there is a power stack. At the top, the ones who owned the time, the doors, the food. Beneath them, gatekeepers who decided who spoke, who ate, who was punished, who was protected. Beneath them, enforcers who could make a threat real with a hand, a glare, a shove. Below that, everyone else living on permission. Direct resistance was suicidal, not always in a single dramatic moment, but in slow ruin. Loss of position, loss of protection, loss of breath. So she watched. She built a fragile pocket of human connection where she could. A glance shared over a basin. A word slipped at the right moment. The relief of being seen by someone who understood without needing explanation. Then the pressure tightened. Violations escalated. Losses stacked. The household's hunger for obedience grew sharper, more humiliating. A bruise appeared where there had not been a bruise. Someone vanished from the workrooms without explanation. A mistake was punished like a crime. Her vow began to feel less like a moral shield and more like a chain. The threshold came as a single, irreversible harm. It is always one moment that refuses to be filed away. Maybe it was someone beaten past the point of lesson. Maybe it was someone taken from the house and not returned. Maybe it was a child made to pay for the violence of adults. However it happened, it rewrote her constraint. I will not become that, she had told herself. And now another sentence forced its way in. If you do nothing, You are part of it. That is where survival turns into intent. She did not wake up and decide to be monstrous. She decided to be deliberate. She began with study because study was safer than rage. She learned routines like a map. Who ate first? Who demanded seconds? Who refused certain dishes? Who drank more at night? Who complained of headaches even before the year turned dark? She watched which hands reached for which serving bowls, and which cups were always poured by the same person. She learned vulnerabilities the way a good cook learns taste, by attention. Some bodies run hot, some run weak, some hide illness until it's late. Some people panic at the idea of contamination. Others refuse to admit they can be hurt at all. And she shaped a plan by observation, not impulse. If she was going to strike at the people at the top, she could not do it like a storm. A storm is noticed. She needed something that looked like the era itself. Slow decline, misread as chance, dismissed as fate. The first attempt moved like weather. Meals continued. The kitchen stayed clean. The plates kept arriving warm. She changed nothing that could be measured easily. She changed what could be dismissed. Timing, portions, who received what, and how often. A careful narrowing of nourishment, not enough to look like open starvation, just enough to make strong bodies less strong. The first body to fail did not collapse in front of witnesses. It faltered in private. A fever, a stomach that would not settle, a man who woke in the night with shaking hands and no explanation that spared his pride. When help was called, the answers were comfortable. Seasonal sickness, bad air, weak constitution. Explanations that preserved the illusion that nothing inside the household was wrong. When the second illness arrived, the house did not change its beliefs. It changed its grip. More rules, more scrutiny, more suspicion aimed at the workers downstairs, because fear is easier to manage when you can assign it a target. For her, it brought an emotional clarity that felt almost cold. Relief that she was not powerless. Horror at what that power required. Then came the complication that shifted the battlefield. Not suspicion yet, not the sharp kind, but control. The gatekeepers began hovering in the kitchen. Ingredients were counted. Keys stayed on belts. Someone was ordered to taste dishes before they left the room, as if a bite could certify safety. Her leverage, access, was being narrowed. The second attempt required an upgrade. An ally appeared, not as a savior, but as a necessity. Someone else in the house who could see what she couldn't, who could warn her when the gatekeepers moved, who could create a brief distraction when access needed to open. They did not deliver speeches. They traded information like contraband, quickly, carefully, only when the risk was worth it. Roles split. One watched upstairs. One listened for changes in routine. One stayed close to the kitchen's choke points. Risk rose under new rules, because secrecy rots in a place built on surveillance. The third attempt widened the scope, and that widening sharpened danger. It was no longer one quiet decline. The plan began to press on a cluster. A gatekeeper who enforced cruelty with a smile, an enforcer who turned threats into bruises, a family member who benefited from harm while pretending to be above it. The timeline compressed. The margin for error thinned. Upstairs, paranoia replaced certainty. People watched each other. Accusations drifted. Searches began. Questions were asked in tones that were really commands. And then came the moral complication. The target who didn't fit neatly into monster. Someone softer, or at least quieter. Someone who occasionally offered relief and then accepted credit for it. Someone whose cruelty was omission, Silence when protest was possible. Laughter when shame should have stopped it. To spare them would preserve a line she once drew around herself. To strike them would admit what the system had taught her. Complicity is not innocence. This decision didn't happen in debate. It happened in the pause of her hand above a bowl, in the instant she imagined a different self. In the end, she chose a truth that felt brutal because it was simple. Softness did not erase the ledger. By then, detection pressure had begun to build. Not a courtroom, not a clean accusation, just the human recognition that the old explanations weren't holding. Too many fevers, too many sudden declines, too many whispers at night. Countermeasures appeared. The house stopped accepting mystery as fate. The old method, slow, quiet, deniable, became harder to sustain. If she continued the same way, the plan would die under tightening control. So she pivoted to immediacy. She abandoned subtlety for a single window move, timed to the moment the household would be most distracted by its own performance. And there was always a performance. The big set piece arrived as a gathering that demanded admiration, a public dinner, a celebration of status, a night when the upstairs filled the room with guests so they could watch themselves be watched. That is where the story began. That is where it tightened. On a night like that, the kitchen becomes a machine. Plates move faster, instructions multiply. The gatekeepers are busy managing appearances. The enforcers stand where guests can see them, not where real vulnerabilities live. And the cook, this woman the record refuses to name, stands at the center of the machine, touching everything. The execution point is not a single dramatic gesture. It is a sequence of small actions hidden inside motion, made possible by the blindness of a busy room. When the first guest coughs, it sounds like laughter. When someone pales, it's blamed on wine. When a body slumps, the room calls it fainting, because fainting is a story polite people understand. Then panic breaks through etiquette. Chairs scrape, voices sharpen. Someone shouts for help. Someone orders windows opened, as if air can fix what air didn't cause. The illusion of control fractures, and the people who built their lives on that illusion look suddenly, terrifyingly human. In the hours that follow, pursuit begins. Not a romantic chase, but the grinding focus of a system embarrassed by vulnerability. Questions harden into accusations. Those with power decide they must find a hand to blame, because admitting the structure itself is guilty would cost too much. The investigation narrows around what it always knows: access. Who touched the food? Who moved between rooms? Who could act without being noticed? Suspicion turns downward, because that is where suspicion always turns in a house like this. Retaliation escalates, punishments inflicted not to find truth, but to reassert dominance. Whether she ran or was taken, the end state locks in under that response. If she fled, it was into uncertainty. Doors that did not open, streets that did not protect. If she was captured, it was because the system can close ranks when it chooses to. If she spoke, her words would be filtered through other mouths. If she stayed silent, silence would be called proof. That is how myth and record split. The legacy question is what survives when certainty dies. In one telling, she becomes a monster. The cook who killed because she was evil, because she was jealous, because she could not be trusted. In another, she becomes an avenger, the one person who refused to keep absorbing harm without consequence. Both versions are too clean. The uncomfortable truth sits between them and refuses easy comfort. A system that cages people will eventually produce someone who learns to use the cage as a weapon. When direct resistance is punished, indirect resistance becomes the only language left. When suffering is normalized, the boundary between justice and cruelty blurs. Not because the victim loves cruelty, but because the system demands proof that pain can travel upward. So the closing dilemma is not whether she was right. It is whether a world that made her possible can ever honestly condemn what she became. Because if the house in Georgia in 1857 could be undone from the kitchen, then the kitchen was never just a place where food was made. It was the one place where control had to trust the hands it refused to name. And that may be the most frightening part of the story.